Hey there, I wanted to take a brief moment and welcome you to the Focus Point podcast. If this is one of the first episodes that you're hearing from us, please head over to our website, thepointoffocus.com, where you can find out some more information about who we are, what we're doing. You can also find other podcast episodes and blog posts there as well. That's thepointoffocus.com. I'm so glad that you decided to give one of our episodes a listen. I really hope that you will be blessed and encouraged through what you hear in this episode. I also encourage you to share this episode with your family and your friends. Once again, I just thank you for taking some time and listening to our episode. Now, let's dive in to today's episode. Well, after an unscheduled break last week, we are back at it this week, and we are continuing on in our series, The Jesus Way. This is episode 4 in that series, and we are going to continue to look at John chapter 4. So if you have a copy of the Bible, whether it's paper or electronic, grab it, open it on up to John chapter 4, and we'll be there in just a little bit. But I want to say, just like I said last week and the week before, that this is not an in-depth, deep dive look at John chapter 4. We are just looking at some parts of it, some components of the story to kind of fit the lens of what we're looking at in the story. We're not like taking it out of context or anything like that. We're just reading it in a different kind of way. And so with that being said, and with the series that we're kind of doing, and we are going to be looking at the Jesus way, but we're going to be looking at John chapter 4. So we're going to be looking at some parts, we're going to skip over some things, we're going to only reference some things. For example, like today, we're going to be looking at mainly some things we looked at in the last episode. So just to kind of catch everybody up, by the way, if you want to, you can go check out all the other episodes in this series, other episodes, all in our archive, pointoffocus.com. You can go there and check those out. But where we started the series, The Jesus Way, and we started with the question, why do we need Jesus, the focus point? And that kind of goes into kind of what our mission statement is, keeping Jesus the focus point. And so we started off the series with that question. So why is that important? Why do we need to keep Jesus as our focus point? So we looked at Psalm 121, and in Psalm 121, we see that God is our help. And we kind of like, okay, so what we're talking about Jesus. Why is Jesus our focus point, right? But so we opened up, we looked at Psalm 121, and we saw how God is our help, and He helps us stay steady. He helps us by protecting us. He's with us. So we broke all of that stuff down, and we said the help that we need to do the things the Jesus way can only come from God. And we said, so why do we need to keep Jesus our focus point? Well, because Jesus is God. So if God is our help, so is Jesus. But it goes a step further with Jesus. Jesus was human. Hebrews 4:15 tells us that He experienced things the way we do, but He did not sin. So He's got that element about Him that we don't have. But it makes Him one good example for us. And so last week we looked at Matthew chapter 14, and we looked at a story of Peter walking on water, and we saw the story as Jesus walks on water, and he comes out to the boat, and Peter gets out, and as long as his eyes were on Jesus, he was safe, and he was able to walk on the water. He was able to handle the storm, right? He was able to handle the things of life. He was able to handle them the Jesus way. But then as soon as he took his eyes off, he began to sink. But just like we already talked about, Jesus was right there to help him. Jesus didn't go, well, if you just keep your eyes on me, like you wouldn't be drowning right now, now would you? He didn't read him the rights. He didn't throw the Bible at him. He didn't do anything like that. He just helped him up. So last week we dove into John chapter 4, and we took a big chunk of John chapter 4, and we opened this idea of goodness and mercy. And we told the story of two seats, the judgment seat and the mercy seat. And we described the judgment seat as being this big, comfortable recliner and things like that. It's got social media, it's got the TV, it's got like all these different places where we can hold our different things that keep us lodged into that chair. It keeps us comfy and cozy, right? And while we're sitting in that chair, we can throw our judgment at anybody else, right? We can look at their social media and be like, well, I wouldn't have done that way. If I was that person, I wouldn't let my kid do that. And if I was this, my house wouldn't be that color. And if I could do this, like, I don't know why they won't just get back. And we can throw judgment. At least I'm not. And we keep throwing those stones at people while we're sitting in our judgment seat, kind of doing the same thing. God sees sin as all equal, right? There's no tiers, there's no levels. Well, at least I haven't murdered somebody, but you have other things that you do that God considers on the same level. And then we talked about the mercy seat and how the mercy seat is where we sit and we look at a situation and we realize that we're the same. We've done similar things because everything's the same. So like we've done things to hurt God. We've done things to hurt our family, our spouse, our friends. You know, we may not have robbed somebody, but we've hurt them in other kinds of ways. And so we look at the mercy seat, we look over at the judgment seat, a place that Jesus never sat, but sometimes we often find ourselves in there. And goodness and mercy doesn't come from the judgment seat. Goodness and mercy comes from the mercy seat. And Jesus always sat in the mercy seat. And we see that in this story. We see his goodness and his mercy because he had to go through Samaria. Oftentimes the Jews went around Samaria because they didn't want to go through because the Samaritans were there. And they can't do that because they're different, right? And so he went there because he wanted to have this conversation. And through this conversation, his goodness in this conversation with this woman, he showed her mercy when he was talking to her and he was telling her, hey, go get your husband. Hey, he knew why she was there, even though, yes, he was Jesus, but even if he wasn't Jesus, he knew why she was there. Women didn't go to the well by themselves. So he knew why she was there and he called her out on it, but he didn't continue. Be like, now, you know, if you would just get your life together, you know, you wouldn't be such a social outcast and you just wouldn't have all these problems if you would. Jesus didn't do that. He told her to go get her husband. He told her, nope, you don't have a husband. You're right. And so he continued on the conversation. And because of his goodness and because of his mercy, she left her jar by the well and went back into the village, telling everybody, come and see. Come and see. And the people came streaming from the village to see him. And many Samaritans believed in Jesus. And then he stayed. So he showed them goodness and mercy. He listened to their stories. He taught them. Everybody in that village couldn't have been perfect. Everybody in that village had to have issues and problems. But because of his goodness, he stayed there with them and he listened. He had mercy on them and they came to know him. So as we continue on in this series, The Jesus Way, once again, there's many, many, many different stories and examples of this as you go through Jesus' life. But this is just one of the most familiar stories in the Bible, and it involves this component, right? So we're going to continue on. So we say, you know, goodness and mercy, right, to each other and our neighbors. So where we're at here is goodness and mercy to each other and our neighbors. Okay, so what do I mean? Well, in Acts 1:8, we see that we're supposed to be witnesses to Judea, Samaria, and to the ends of the earth, right? So in Judea would be home. Samaria would be out of our remote area, out of our community, right? Out of our city. And to the ends of the earth would be any place that's not here, right? Anywhere we're not where we live. So when I think about this, so I say to each other and our neighbors. Okay, well, we all kind of know what our neighbors is. If you grew up in church, you know, you've heard the story. That's why I bring up the Good Samaritan story. And religious experts like, what does the law of Moses say? And all of this stuff like this. And Jesus returns him and says, hey, you need to, what does the law of Moses say? Right? He's like, what do I do to inherit eternal life? What does the law say? And he says, you must love the Lord your God with all your heart, soul, mind, and strength, and love your neighbor. right? Jesus says that in Matthew 22. And then the man goes, okay, well, who is my neighbor? Right? And so often we go into the story of the Good Samaritan, right? The parable of the Good Samaritan, and that's another familiar story in the Bible. So we've got this Samaritan story of this woman at the well, and we've got this Samaritan story of the Good Samaritan, in which Jesus makes the Samaritan a hero to a prominently Jewish audience. So, what does all this mean? Okay, so I classify each other. When I say each other, I mean followers of Jesus. Each other, right? It's each other. And then our neighbors is those who aren't following Jesus. And so when I say, so each other, so like Jesus' disciples, right? They're followers of Jesus. They're each other, right? And they're caring for each other. As a matter of fact, right now in John chapter 4, while Jesus is having this conversation with the woman at the well, it says in verse 8, he was there alone at the time because his disciples had gone into the village to buy some food. So they had been traveling, as the story opens, they had been traveling, and Jesus was sitting by the well because he was tired from their travel. So the disciples they're doing some caring for each other, right? They're going out, they're buying some food, and they're doing that kind of stuff. So each other, goodness and mercy to each other. Okay, so then goodness and mercy to our neighbors is something different because they're not each other right yet. They have the ability to be each other. Right? Each other is like, if you say church, well, not necessarily, because there are some people that are neighbors still because they don't really know Jesus. They come in there to check it out. Right? So there's this difference. Each other and our neighbors. Each other is when you come alongside, you come to church and as followers of Jesus and you talk and all this stuff like that. But then there's other people that come into church for the first time. Maybe they didn't grow up in church. Maybe they're trying to check things out because their life is a wreck and they're trying to figure out how to straighten it out, so they decided to try church again. Or maybe they've been each other in the past, but they're so far away from Jesus because they haven't been going to church, they haven't felt like they've been following him, they haven't been like connected to him in the way they feel they should be, and they may feel like a neighbor at that point. So each other and our neighbors. So how do we show goodness and mercy to these things? Well, each other, I believe goodness and mercy is a little bit different than goodness and mercy to our neighbors, right? And it's illustrated here in this story, because when Jesus comes in, okay, I picture it like this. Let's start here. I picture it like when you have like friends, you have a friend group, right? And there's other couples and they have kids. Like, so in my life, I have a couple friends who are, parents of kids who they all kind of encompass in this age bracket of 17 to 12. Okay, this one of my friends has a 7 or 8 year old, so it's kind of like the main bulk of these people and their kids are 17 to like 12 to 17. Okay, so we kind of got it all in there, and parenting takes a village. And we often say, like, these are my church kids, or these are my adopted kids, right? I don't know if you do that with people at your church or people in your community. It doesn't necessarily have to be, it can be the neighborhood kids, right? And in this way, like, we've adapted what is, like, adoptive parenting or whatever, right? Where the parent of the other children in our families give us this parental power, right? They help keep our kids in line, right? This lady that goes to our church, she will, my son, my youngest one, will often come over there and he'll be doing something and she'll be like, hey, knock that off. What are we doing? Stuff like, little things like that. But she's not like a part of the family, right? She's a part of my each other family. She's a part of my church family. She's a part of that family. But my like family, in other words, she can't like ground my son. Right, that's not in her jurisdiction. So when you think about that, so when you look at each other, they're part of the family, right? So I'm harder on my son because he's in my family and I want him to do right. I have grounding authority and all of these things like that, so I can do that. But outside of that family, is the goodness and mercy is different, right? My goodness and mercy is a little bit different, but it also comes with some kind of discipline, right? Like, you can't just be like, oh, well, I'm going to give you a pass on that one, I'm going to give you a pass on that one, I'm going to give you a pass on that every time. There are some times where I know my kids are expecting something, expecting a punishment, expecting whatever, and I decide not to. That's mercy, right? And that mercy comes outside of that, too. But when you're inside the family, this goodness and mercy is a little bit different because you don't want people to stray away. They're following Jesus, but they're going through a rough patch, and so you want this goodness and mercy to be a part of their life, but it looks different because they're in the family, so we can be a little bit more, hey, like, don't do that. Let's stay, like, all of that. Whereas goodness and mercy to a neighbor is a little bit more like what Jesus did. Like, my family friend will look at my son a little bit differently and be like, hey, let's not, like, do that, but it's not to the level where I could. And a little bit more patient, a little bit more. And so when we see that, and we see it come out in the story, where this woman is expecting, Jesus to treat her like everybody else, right? And it's clear that she's not like in each other, because when the disciples come back, like, the disciples treat her like everybody else is treating her. Jesus, what are you doing? Because she's there alone, the disciples probably can figure out, or they assume that she's an outcast, a social outcast. She's done something to be there alone without other women there. Because women don't go to the well by themselves, and they surely don't go in the middle of the day. So why is Jesus talking to this person? We see that down as they come back. The disciples were urging Jesus, in verse 31, the disciples were urging Jesus to eat. And they didn't, sorry, I was ahead of myself. Verse 27. Just then, Jesus' disciples came back. They were shocked to find him talking to a woman, but none of them had the nerve to ask, what are you doing with her? Why are you talking to her? And then they started, like, urging him to eat, right? That caring for each other. But they had this thought in verse 27. And it's not, like, a big thought, but it's, like, why are they talking to... Because, like I said last week, she was a woman, she was a Samaritan, and he was a rabbi. Talking to this woman all by himself, alone, right? And because she was there, it adds that extra... She was there by herself, which indicates, well, okay, and there's something else a part of it. So... But what Jesus does is his goodness and mercy. He didn't, whereas goodness and mercy for each other, we would kind of like, hey, maybe this isn't right, like all this, and you kind of can unpack the situation a little bit more. Jesus doesn't do any unpacking. He says, go get your husband in verse 16, go get your husband. I don't have a husband. You're right. And that's the gist of the conversation. That's just the conversation. He doesn't go, it says right here in this scroll. He doesn't pull out his scroll out of his backpack and be like, hey, check this out. Maybe if you just got your life, like, he doesn't do that. Goodness and mercy looks different, right? It's simple, like, hey, you know what? I've messed up too. I'm no different than you. I've messed up. Just because I'm a follower of Jesus doesn't mean I've messed up. It's more of a welcoming kind of thing when we have goodness and mercy for our neighbors. It's different, right? Because when we see, and then we see, verse 28, the woman left her jar beside the well and ran back to the village, telling everyone, come and see the man who told me everything. Could this be the Messiah? And they came streaming from the village to see him. So her testimony, her witness, her encounter of goodness and mercy with Jesus, and she went and told other people. And there's many other places in the Bible where that happens. In the story of the Good Samaritan, right? The Samaritan was made the hero of the story by helping the Jew who the other Jewish people wouldn't even help. Like, the other followers of Jesus wouldn't even help him. The Samaritan did. That's goodness and mercy to our neighbors, right? It doesn't say if the Good Samaritan was a follower of Jesus or if it was just a kind man, right? But that's goodness and mercy. And because of that, verse 39, once again, many Samaritans from the village believed in Jesus. When they came out to see him, they begged him to stay at their village, so he stayed 2 more days. Sometimes It means we got to go out of the way. And Jesus here is simply saying that this is what goodness and mercy looks like to each other and to our neighbors. The Bible tells us, Jesus actually tells us that how we love each other is how we show others that we are followers of Him, that we are Jesus followers. If you love one another, you show that you are my followers. And we've talked about this at the beginning of the year kind of a couple different times in our I've Got the Joy series when we went through the book of Philippians. We looked at this and we've said it a couple different times. How we treat each other, right? So this caring for each other matters, because how we treat each other, how we act, how we are with each other matters. If people come into church, into your local church, into wherever, and we're yelling and screaming at each other, we're arguing over the carpet color, we're calling each other names, we're, hostile with each other, that's not going to look very good. Be like, well, why do I want to follow Jesus if that's how people act? I can get that without following Jesus. Shoot, I got that this morning. Sometimes when I read the Bible, I like doing the what if kind of scenario in this. And this story is a really good one to put it on. Right, when I'm talking about goodness and mercy, and I'm talking about how we love each other, it shows that we are followers of Jesus. And if that's the case, well, what if this scenario was a little bit different? What if the disciples weren't in the village buying food? What if they were all kind of sitting there, maybe in separate groups, or maybe all as one big group, but they were kind of just sitting there by the well, resting from their trip, and Jesus is where He was, right? Because He was there for a purpose. He was there. He wasn't there trying to hide. He was there to meet this woman. What if, though, when she got there, the disciples are sitting over there arguing and screaming and cussing and having whatever, and calling each other names and poking fights and all of this stuff? What if that's what the disciples were doing? Well, Jesus is standing over here with this woman, trying to talk about living water, trying to talk about eternal life, trying to talk about following Him, trying to help her see the goodness and mercy that Jesus has to offer. And the disciples aren't being good. Like, they're not having goodness with each other. They're not having mercy with each other. They're calling each other names. They're poking fun. They're whatever they're doing over there. Wouldn't that be kind of like, well, aren't they your followers? What are they doing? So I think that what Jesus has for us in this is goodness and mercy to each other and our neighbors. Although different, it is the same. The goodness and the mercy need to be prominent in our walk with Him. If we're going to do things the Jesus way, we got to see how He did it. And this isn't the only story that we see that in, right? One of the stories, like the disciples, a blind man calls out to Jesus. Blind Bartimaeus calls out, "The Lord, have mercy on me." Right? It's a different kind of mercy, but it's still this mercy, this compassion that we have to have. As I said, if Jesus was sat in the judgment seat all the time, there is no cross. There is no help for us. If God didn't send Jesus to begin with, then there's nothing for us. That's all done out of goodness and mercy. And it's difficult because sometimes maybe the person that we're trying to show goodness and mercy to hasn't always been the kindest, hasn't always been the nicest, and we feel like we're forgiving them, but we feel like we're letting them go, or letting them off the hook. And in reality, you kind of are, but you're letting God handle it after that. If we're doing what we're supposed to be doing, if we're forgiving, if we're showing this goodness and mercy, if we're loving people the way that we're supposed to do, right? If we're loving God and we're loving others the way that we're supposed to be, then God is going to handle the rest of it. When we hold on to it, it's because we're sitting in the judgment seat. When we tighten our arms and we hold a grudge and we're like, I'm not going to, they don't deserve my forgiveness. They don't deserve my help. They did it to themselves. That's holding on to the judgment seat. That's where Jesus never sat. Because Jesus is the only one on planet Earth that can look at the world and go, they don't need what I've given them. They don't need it from me. They don't deserve it. And yet He did it anyway. So that's the challenge that I believe Jesus has for us out of this story. This goodness and this mercy that he showed this woman changed her life. And he can change the lives of other people, whether we know them or not. Just being able to show them goodness and mercy goes a long way. The woman didn't even know, it's clear here in John chapter 4, the woman didn't know who he was. Because she says here in verse 25, the woman said, I know the Messiah is coming, the one who is called the Christ. When he comes, he will explain everything to us. And then Jesus told her that I am the Messiah. I am that person. She just thought she was talking to some Jew. She says up here in verse 9, the woman was surprised, for Jews refused to have anything to do with Samaritans. So this whole thing, she didn't even know who he was. A lot of times people don't even know who we are. It's just a matter of showing goodness and mercy, being kind, looking at the example of Jesus. That's why we need to keep him the focus point. That's how we can do things the Jesus way. That's how we can be who Jesus wants us to be. So important. So we've got one more week in this series, and we're going to take it just one more step, continuing to look at John chapter 4. But I believe that's what, this goodness and mercy, right? Because we have goodness and mercy, we should show goodness and mercy. And it's hard, but we should do it with each other and our neighbors, because that's clear what Jesus says. And so as we continue on for the rest of the year here, I just kind of want to fill you in. In 2 weeks, we're going to start a series on the Lord's Prayer, right? We're keeping Jesus the focus point, but it's also kind of continuing on with our theme verse, kind of like our overall theme, which I'll explain a little bit when we get there. But it's just, that's kind of continuing that, but it just kind of this is the way Jesus tells us to pray. So we're going to look at that as, once again, keeping Jesus the focus point. And then we're also going to look and see about being thankful. And then we're going to start in the Gospel of John, which I'm really excited for. So I hope that this encourages you. I hope it kind of gives you a way to kind of see what goodness and mercy looks like. And I know it's I'm not giving you examples. Maybe you can do it at work. Maybe you can do it here. It's because how we see goodness and mercy. Jesus went everywhere. Like Jesus to the 12 disciples, he showed them goodness and mercy at one point. Matthew was a tax collector. He walked right up to him and he said, come, follow me. And he leaves the choice to them. That's what goodness and mercy does. The goodness is, hey, come follow me. Hey, come to church with me. Hey, come be a part of this. And the mercy is, well, you got to leave them to their own decisions sometimes. So I hope this encouraged you. I hope that we can kind of see how we can just be extra goodness and mercy to people, the way Jesus was to this woman, because it changed her life. And the more just kind we are, no matter what people say, no matter how people act, no matter what people do, show them goodness and mercy, because that's what Jesus did. That's what Jesus did from the cross. That's what Jesus did during his whole bogus trial. He showed goodness and mercy. Because he knew what he was doing it for. So I hope to see you next week as we close out. Next week we'll close out this series, The Jesus Way. And I hope that you'll be there. And I hope you'll kind of continue on with us as we go into our the Lord's Prayer. And we'll kind of dive into that. So I'll see you next time.